The airport buzzed with activity as passengers hurried through the terminal, dragging their suitcases behind them. Gate announcements echoed through the speakers, blending with the chatter of travelers. Among the crowd, a frail yet dignified elderly woman moved slowly, her silver hair neatly tied back, her sharp eyes scanning the surroundings with quiet curiosity. She wore a simple but elegant navy blue dress and carried a modest handbag. Nothing about her screamed wealth or power. To the outside world, she was just another elderly traveler, perhaps a grandmother visiting family or an old woman off to see the world one last time. Her name was Margaret Whitmore. What no one knew, what even the airline staff were oblivious to, was that she wasn't just any passenger. She was the chairwoman of the very airline she was flying with today. A self-made woman who had spent decades building her career in the aviation industry, she had chosen to travel anonymously, without security, without special treatment. She wanted to see how her airline truly operated when no one knew she was watching. At the boarding gate, passengers lined up, waiting for their group to be called. Margaret moved at her own pace, careful with each step. Just as she reached the line, a sharp voice cut through the air. "Ma'am, you need to keep up with the line. We don't have all day," snapped a flight attendant, her tone laced with impatience. Margaret turned her head slightly, startled by the hostility in the young woman's voice. She wasn't accustomed to being rushed like this, and she certainly wasn't used to being spoken to in such a disrespectful manner. "I'm moving as quickly as I can, dear," Margaret said, her voice calm but firm. The flight attendant, whose name tag read Jessica, rolled her eyes. She was in her late 20s, tall, with sharp features and an air of arrogance. She had worked for the airline for years, but instead of growing more patient with time, she had become hardened, treating passengers as nothing more than a chore. "You need to keep up," Jessica said again, this time stepping forward and placing her hand on Margaret's back to push her along. Margaret stiffened. It wasn't the touch itself, it was the sheer lack of respect. But she said nothing. She had seen all kinds of people in her life. Some, like Jessica, were quick to judge. Others, she knew, would show their true colors when the time was right. As she made her way onto the plane, Margaret noticed Jessica rolling her eyes once more and muttering something under her breath. But before she could say anything, another passenger brushed past, nearly knocking Margaret off balance. "Excuse me," Margaret exclaimed, steadying herself on the edge of a seat. "Watch where you're going," Jessica barked at her, as if the incident had been Margaret's fault. Margaret's lips pressed into a thin line, but she held her tongue. This wasn't the time, yet. Passengers continued to board, filling up the narrow aisle with their bags and restless energy. Margaret carefully made her way to her seat, 12B, a simple economy class seat, right in the middle of the plane. She had specifically chosen not to fly first class today. She wanted to see how her airline treated its everyday customers, the ones who didn't have fancy titles or VIP perks. She settled in, adjusting her seatbelt, when suddenly, Jessica stormed down the aisle, her expression dark. "Ma'am, you're in the wrong seat," she said coldly. Margaret blinked, pulling out her ticket. "No, dear, this is my seat," she replied, holding up her boarding pass. Jessica barely glanced at it before snatching it from Margaret's hand. "No, this says 12A, she insisted, even though the ticket clearly stated 12B. Margaret frowned but remained patient. "I believe you may have misread." Jessica cut her off. "Do I look like I misread it?" she snapped. The passengers around them began to murmur, sensing the tension. Some looked uncomfortable, while others pretended not to notice. Margaret, however, was not the type to let intimidation shake her. "Young lady, I believe an apology is in order," Margaret said, her voice carrying an air of authority that she rarely used. Jessica scoffed. "Apology? For what?" Before Margaret could respond, Jessica did something unthinkable. In a moment of frustration, she raised her hand and gave Margaret's shoulder a light but firm slap, as if disciplining a child. Gasps erupted from the surrounding passengers. Margaret's eyes widened. Not from pain, but from sheer disbelief. For a long moment, there was silence. The weight of what had just happened hung thick in the air. Jessica, realizing too late what she had done, took a step back. But it was clear she didn't yet understand the gravity of her mistake. Margaret slowly reached up, adjusting the pearl earring on her left ear. Then, with the slightest tilt of her head, she gave Jessica a look that could send shivers down anyone's spine. The plane hadn't even taken off yet. But for Jessica, her career was about to nosedive straight into disaster. Jessica's face burned as the eyes of passengers locked onto her, a mixture of shock, confusion, and quiet disapproval spreading through the cabin. A few whispers rippled across the rows, some passengers exchanging knowing glances, while others shifted uncomfortably in their seats. Margaret, however, remained impossibly calm. She didn't flinch. She didn't lash out. Instead, she took a slow, measured breath and smoothed out an invisible wrinkle on her dress. Her expression remained unreadable, though a keen observer might have noticed the sharp glint in her eyes, one that hinted at something deeper beneath the surface. Jessica swallowed hard, realizing that she had acted impulsively. But instead of apologizing, she folded her arms and let out an exasperated sigh. "Look, ma'am, I don't have time for this. We have a schedule to keep." Margaret finally turned her full attention to Jessica. Her voice was calm but carried a weight that felt almost unnatural for someone so small, so fragile-looking. "I suggest you take a moment and think about what you've just done," she said quietly, "before you make this situation worse for yourself." Jessica let out a short laugh, though it lacked any real confidence. "Are you threatening me?" Margaret didn't answer right away. Instead, she studied the young woman in front of her as if seeing through the layers of arrogance, impatience, and unchecked authority. Passengers were still staring. Some had their phones out, subtly recording the exchange. The air inside the cabin felt thick, tense. Even the other flight attendants seemed hesitant to step in. Just then, another crew member approached. A male flight attendant, slightly older, with a neatly pressed uniform and a name tag that read Daniel. He had clearly picked up on the situation from a distance, and now looked from Jessica to Margaret with a frown. "Everything all right here?" he asked, his tone professional but firm. Jessica rolled her eyes. "Just handling a seating issue." Daniel gave Margaret a quick glance, then looked at the boarding pass still in Jessica's hand. He took it gently, his eyes scanning the details before he sighed. "Jessica, this says 12B. The passenger is in the correct seat." Jessica's face twitched. For a split second, she looked as though she wanted to argue. But with the weight of the situation pressing down on her, she merely clenched her jaw and handed the ticket back. "Fine. Whatever." Daniel turned to Margaret with an apologetic nod. "I'm very sorry for the confusion, ma'am. Please let me know if you need anything during the flight." Margaret's lips curled slightly, though it wasn't exactly a smile. "Thank you, young man. That will be all." Daniel nodded and stepped back, his eyes lingering on Jessica as if silently warning her to watch herself. Then, without another word, he turned and returned to his duties. Jessica, still stiff with frustration, muttered something under her breath before storming toward the front of the plane. Margaret leaned back into her seat, adjusting her seatbelt as the murmurs around her slowly died down. But she knew the moment hadn't passed, it had only just begun. As the plane prepared for takeoff, she gazed out of the window, her thoughts drifting back to why she had chosen this particular flight in the first place. This wasn't just a routine journey. This was an evaluation. For months, Margaret had been hearing whispers, stories from employees who had dared to speak up, from passengers who had written letters of complaint. It wasn't about delays or lost luggage. It was about something deeper, something troubling. Stories of certain staff members treating customers poorly, stories of power being abused in subtle but dangerous ways. She had been told that some employees had forgotten what it meant to serve. Margaret had built this airline from the ground up. It had been her life's work. And while she had stepped back from the day-to-day operations in recent years, she had never truly stopped paying attention. She had always believed that how an airline treated its passengers, every single one of them, was a reflection of its true values. And now, she was seeing those values tested right in front of her. The plane lifted off, and as the city below grew smaller, Margaret's mind sharpened. This wasn't just about a rude flight attendant. It was about something bigger. Jessica had no idea who she had just mistreated, and by the time they landed, she would learn the truth in a way she'd never forget. Margaret folded her hands in her lap, her expression unreadable. The flight was just beginning, and so was the lesson. As the plane climbed higher, Margaret let her gaze wander over the clouds outside the window, but her mind remained sharp, absorbing every detail around her. The hum of the engines, the muffled conversations, the occasional chime of the seatbelt sign. She had spent decades in aviation, and yet, this flight felt different. It wasn't about the destination. It was about what was unfolding in front of her. A few rows ahead, Jessica moved with quick, sharp motions, her frustration still evident in the way she handled tasks. She poured drinks with little care, barely making eye contact with passengers as she passed them their cups. Every now and then, she threw a glance over her shoulder at Margaret, as if still stewing over their earlier encounter. But Margaret remained unfazed, her hands calmly folded in her lap. A flight attendant's job was not easy. Margaret knew that better than most. Long hours, difficult passengers, constant pressure. She had seen young employees struggle to balance professionalism with exhaustion. But she had also seen the difference between those who genuinely cared and those who let power get the better of them. A soft voice interrupted her thoughts. "Excuse me, ma'am," said the woman seated next to her. She was in her 50s, with warm brown eyes and a nervous smile. "I saw what happened earlier. Are you all right?" Margaret turned to her, her expression gentle. "Oh, I'm quite all right, dear. But thank you for asking." The woman hesitated before speaking again. "That flight attendant. She's always like that. I've flown with this airline before, and I remember her. Last time, she was just as rude, but I didn't say anything. I figured maybe she was having a bad day." Margaret tilted her head slightly, taking in the woman's words. "And now?" The woman let out a quiet sigh. "Now, I'm not so sure. I mean, everyone has bad days, but—" She shook her head. "It just doesn't feel right, the way she treats people." Margaret gave a small nod, her mind turning. One incident could be excused. A pattern, however, was something else entirely. Across the aisle, a young boy tugged on his mother's sleeve, his voice a soft whisper. "Mom, I'm thirsty." His mother, a tired-looking woman in her 30s, smiled and patted his head. "Just a little longer, sweetie. The flight attendants will come by soon." But the boy was restless. His little hands gripped the armrest, his legs swinging under the seat. After a few minutes, he finally turned toward the aisle and hesitantly raised a hand, trying to get Jessica's attention as she passed by with a tray of drinks. "Excuse me." His voice was small, polite. Jessica barely glanced at him before rolling her eyes. "You'll have to wait, kid," she muttered before walking off without stopping. Margaret's lips pressed together in a thin line. The boy's mother sighed and reached into her bag, pulling out a juice box she had packed. "Here, sweetheart." The child took it, but Margaret could see the flicker of disappointment in his face. He had only asked for a simple thing. And yet, he had been brushed aside as if he didn't matter. Margaret leaned slightly toward the woman beside her. "Would you happen to remember the name of the captain for this flight?" she asked casually. The woman blinked, surprised by the question. "Oh, I think they said Captain Reynolds? Or was it Richardson?" Margaret gave a small smile. "Reynolds," she murmured. "Good man." The woman tilted her head. "Do you know him?" Margaret chuckled softly. "I know many people in this airline, dear." The woman didn't ask any more questions, but a curious expression lingered on her face. Meanwhile, at the front of the cabin, Jessica had stopped near the galley, speaking in hushed but urgent tones to another crew member. The other flight attendant, a younger woman named Rachel, looked visibly uncomfortable. "I don't care if she complains," Jessica hissed. "Old people always think they deserve special treatment. She's just some cranky grandma who probably flies once a decade." Rachel hesitated. "But she didn't really do anything wrong." Jessica scoffed. "Are you serious? Did you see how she looked at me? Like she owns the place." She shook her head. "People like that think they can just demand respect. But you know what? I'm not here to kiss up to some random old lady." Rachel bit her lip, shifting uncomfortably. She wasn't sure what to say. She had only been working for the airline for 6 months, and she didn't want to get on Jessica's bad side. But something about the way Jessica was talking made her uneasy. Back in her seat, Margaret remained quiet, her fingers lightly tapping against her knee as she thought. She had seen enough. But the flight was far from over. She wasn't going to say anything just yet. No, that moment would come soon. And when it did, it would be Jessica's turn to realize that respect wasn't just given, it was earned. The air inside the cabin remained still, but the tension was building, unseen and unstoppable. Margaret knew how this would end. Jessica, however, had no idea that her world was about to change. The flight carried on, but the energy in the cabin had shifted. The air felt heavier, laced with an unspoken tension that seemed to grow with every passing minute. Margaret remained still, her posture relaxed, but her mind was working, piecing everything together like a puzzle she had already solved. Jessica moved through the aisle, but her confidence from earlier had dulled. She could feel the stares, the quiet judgment from passengers who had seen what happened. Her frustration simmered beneath the surface, and it only deepened when she glanced back at Margaret, who sat so calmly, as if she wasn't bothered in the slightest. That annoyed her. Most passengers, when scolded, backed down. They apologized, looked away, avoided confrontation. But this old woman? She wasn't flustered at all. It was almost like she was waiting for something. Rachel, the younger flight attendant, approached hesitantly. She had been watching Jessica closely, uneasy with how things had unfolded. Lowering her voice, she whispered, "Jess, maybe we should." "Drop it," Jessica snapped, not even letting her finish. "You're new, so let me give you some advice. If you want to last in this job, you don't let passengers walk all over you. If you start bending over backward for every complaint, they'll eat you alive." Rachel hesitated, shifting on her feet. But she didn't actually do anything. Jessica sighed dramatically. "Look, I know you're still figuring things out, but trust me. Some people just think they're more important than they are. You don't have to treat them special just because they act like they own the place." Rachel wanted to push back, to say something, but the way Jessica dismissed her made her hesitate. She wasn't sure what to do. Meanwhile, Margaret took a deep breath, settling into her seat. She had flown thousands of miles, sat on countless planes, observed customer service at its best and worst. But what she was witnessing now wasn't just about rudeness. It was a mindset, a dangerous one. The plane hit a pocket of turbulence, causing a few gasps among passengers as it rocked slightly. Jessica, gripping a tray in her hand, stumbled but quickly steadied herself. Taking a deep breath, she continued moving through the aisle, pretending not to notice how many people avoided looking at her. Then, another small moment unfolded. A middle-aged man in a business suit pressed the call button above his seat. Jessica, clearly annoyed, walked over, forcing a tight-lipped smile. "Yes." The man spoke politely. "Sorry, I just wanted to ask if I could get another bottle of water." Jessica sighed as if he had asked for something impossible. "You already had one." The man blinked, surprised. "I know, I just..." We have to make sure we have enough for everyone, Jessica interrupted, her tone clipped. We can't just hand them out like candy. A few passengers turned their heads. The man hesitated before nodding. All right, never mind then. Jessica walked away without another word. Margaret exhaled slowly, watching everything unfold. These weren't isolated incidents. This was a pattern. A dangerous one. And the worst part? Jessica wasn't even aware of the damage she was doing. Another crew member, Daniel, approached Jessica at the front of the plane. He had been watching her behavior, and now his patience was wearing thin. Jessica, he said in a low voice, you're being too harsh. Jessica turned to him, scowling. Oh, come on. Are you serious? Daniel crossed his arms. Yeah, I am. You're treating people like they're an inconvenience. That's not how this works. Jessica rolled her eyes. We're not maids, Daniel. If people can't handle a little tough love, they shouldn't fly. Daniel studied her, disappointment clear on his face. He had worked with many flight attendants over the years. Some handled stress well. Some didn't. But Jessica, she didn't even seem to care. Margaret listened to the conversation from a distance, her sharp ears picking up every word. She had enough experience to know that Jessica wasn't just having a bad day. This was who she was on the job. And that was a problem. As the flight continued, Jessica found herself growing more restless. She could still feel Margaret's presence like a shadow following her every move. Why wouldn't she just let it go? Most passengers would have moved on by now. Something about that woman bothered her. The plane began its descent, the captain's voice filling the cabin, announcing their approach to the destination. Passengers started preparing for landing, some adjusting their seats, others stretching. But Margaret remained exactly as she was, composed, quiet, waiting. Jessica let out a breath. It was almost over. She just had to get through the landing, and then this would all be behind her. But what she didn't know, what she couldn't have possibly guessed, was that the real turbulence was yet to come. Margaret had been patient. She had watched, listened, observed. But now it was time. And Jessica was about to learn that the woman she had dismissed so easily wasn't just another passenger. She was about to learn the truth. And there would be no escaping it. As the plane continued its descent, the tension in the air was thick. Margaret remained composed, her expression unreadable, while Jessica moved through the cabin, forcing herself to act as if nothing was wrong. But deep down, something gnawed at her, an uneasy feeling she couldn't shake. It wasn't just the silent stares from passengers who had witnessed her behavior. It was Margaret. Something about her presence, the way she carried herself, made Jessica feel like she had missed something important. Margaret finally shifted in her seat and pressed the call button. The chime rang out softly, but in Jessica's ears, it felt like an alarm. She turned toward the source, her eyes narrowing as she saw Margaret's calm expression. For a brief second, she considered ignoring it. After all, they were almost landing. But something in her gut told her she couldn't. Forcing a neutral expression, Jessica approached. Yes? She asked, trying to keep her voice steady. Margaret looked up at her, her gaze steady. Would you mind bringing me a glass of water? Her voice was polite, but there was something in her tone, something measured. Jessica exhaled sharply. We're about to land. I can't serve drinks now. Margaret simply nodded. I understand. But I believe I asked earlier, and you never followed through. Jessica's jaw tightened. Passengers nearby were listening now. She could feel their eyes on her. Before she could respond, a voice crackled over the intercom. Ladies and gentlemen, this is your captain speaking. We'll be landing shortly. On behalf of the airline, I want to personally thank you for flying with us today. Margaret's lips curled ever so slightly. Jessica missed it, but Rachel, who had been standing nearby, noticed. There was something in that expression, a quiet certainty. The moment the plane touched down and began taxiing to the gate, Jessica let out a relieved breath. It was over. Whatever that weird tension had been, she didn't have to deal with it anymore. Soon, passengers would be off the plane, and she could forget all about the cranky old woman in 3B. But then, just as she turned to head toward the galley, she heard something that made her heart stop. "Excuse me," Margaret said, this time addressing another flight attendant. "Could you kindly inform the captain that I'd like to have a word with him after we disembark?" Jessica froze. The word sent a chill down her spine, but she quickly pushed it aside. So what? Margaret wanted to complain? Fine. It wasn't the first time a passenger had gone straight to the captain. They always thought it would make a difference, but in the end, it never did. Complaints went through the proper channels. A simple report, a slap on the wrist, and life moved on. But as the plane reached the gate and passengers began gathering their belongings, Jessica couldn't shake the feeling that something was different this time. As soon as the seatbelt sign turned off, Margaret stood. She moved with quiet grace, gathering her small handbag before stepping into the aisle. Passengers watched her, some of them whispering. They had all seen how Jessica treated her. Some even looked at Jessica now, their expressions unreadable. Rachel hesitated before stepping closer to Jessica. "I think you should." "I don't need advice," Jessica cut her off. "I've handled passengers like her before." Rachel swallowed but said nothing. Then, as passengers began exiting the plane, the captain himself appeared at the front of the cabin. He was a tall man in his late 50s, with salt and pepper hair and a composed demeanor. The second he spotted Margaret, his expression shifted. A flicker of recognition. Then, something else. Respect. Jessica's stomach dropped. The captain's voice was warm, professional. "Madam Chairwoman," he greeted, offering a polite nod. "I wasn't aware you were on this flight." Silence. Jessica felt the world tilt beneath her feet. Her mouth went dry. "Chairwoman?" Margaret smiled. "I prefer to fly quietly," she said, her voice calm. "Gives me a chance to see how things truly operate." The captain nodded. "Of course." Then, his gaze flickered, just briefly, toward Jessica. Jessica felt her heart pound against her ribs. Passengers were still lingering near the front, listening, piecing things together. The whispers began. Margaret turned slightly, her gaze finally landing on Jessica. There was no anger in her expression, no visible frustration, just quiet authority. "I believe we'll need to have a discussion," Margaret said, her voice carrying just enough weight to make Jessica's stomach churn. Jessica opened her mouth, but no words came out. This wasn't just a complaint. This was something else entirely. And now, she was in far deeper than she had ever realized. Jessica's entire body felt frozen, her mind racing as the weight of Margaret's words sank in. The passengers who had witnessed everything now stared with wide eyes, whispering among themselves. The woman she had dismissed so easily, the woman she had treated with outright disdain, wasn't just any passenger. She was the chairwoman of the airline. Margaret remained composed, her expression unreadable, but the silence around them made every second stretch unbearably long. Jessica's mouth opened, then closed. What could she even say? Apologies suddenly felt meaningless. Excuses wouldn't work. For the first time since stepping onto the plane, she had no control over the situation. The captain cleared his throat and turned to Margaret. "Shall we step into the jet bridge for a private discussion, Madam Chairwoman?" Margaret gave a small nod, but before she moved, her eyes locked onto Jessica. "I'd like Miss Turner to join us." Jessica felt her breath hitch. Her last name sounded heavy in the air, spoken with such purpose that it made her chest tighten. Rachel, standing just behind them, looked at Jessica with concern. The younger flight attendant had sensed trouble brewing from the moment Jessica first snapped at Margaret, but even she hadn't expected this. Jessica forced herself to move, her legs stiff as she followed Margaret and the captain toward the jet bridge. The murmurs of passengers followed them, growing fainter as they stepped out of the cabin. The door shut behind them, enclosing them in a more private space, but the weight of the moment only grew heavier. Margaret turned slowly, folding her hands in front of her. Her expression wasn't angry. It wasn't even disappointed in the way Jessica had expected. It was something worse. Calm, controlled, patient. "I'd like you to walk me through what happened on this flight," Margaret said, her voice smooth but firm. "Start to finish. From your perspective." Jessica felt a lump in her throat. Her usual sharpness, her confidence, had vanished. The realization that she had been watched, not just by a passenger, but by the chairwoman herself, made her stomach churn. She hesitated, struggling to find the right words. "I was just doing my job." Margaret lifted a brow, waiting. Jessica swallowed hard. "I didn't mean any harm," she continued, her voice quieter now. I thought you were being difficult. I didn't realize who you were." Margaret nodded slightly. "So, if I were just another elderly passenger, it would have been acceptable?" Jessica flinched. She knew there was no good answer to that. Margaret exhaled softly. "Miss Turner, let me tell you a little secret about this airline. I built it with the belief that service isn't just about policies and procedures. It's about people. I started from the ground up, not in a boardroom, but as a flight attendant myself. I know the stress of long flights, demanding passengers, and exhaustion. But none of that ever justifies treating someone with disrespect." Jessica's breath caught. She had assumed Margaret was some out-of-touch executive, someone who had never stepped foot on a plane except in first class. But she had been one of them. She had walked the same aisles, faced the same pressures. Margaret continued, her voice unwavering. "You didn't just dismiss me. You dismissed everyone. The man who asked for water. The passengers who saw you roll your eyes at them. Even your own colleague when she tried to intervene." Jessica's hands clenched at her sides. She had always believed she was firm, not cruel. That she was efficient, not dismissive. But hearing it laid out like this, she couldn't ignore the truth. Margaret's expression softened just slightly. People don't remember if their coffee was served at the right temperature. They don't remember if their seat was 1 inch too cramped. But they do remember how they were treated. And today, you made an entire flight of passengers feel unimportant. Jessica's throat tightened. She had spent years perfecting her routine, believing she knew how to handle people. But in her attempt to keep control, she had lost sight of the very core of her job. The captain, who had remained silent, finally spoke. "Chairwoman, how would you like to proceed?" Jessica stiffened, bracing for what was coming. She had no doubt she was about to be fired. Margaret studied her for a long moment. Then, instead of delivering the words Jessica expected, she said something completely different. "I want her to take a mandatory training refresher," Margaret said. "Not just any training. The same program I went through when I started. She will work under the most senior attendants in the company. And for the next 6 months, she will not work a single flight without direct supervision." Jessica's eyes widened. She hadn't been expecting that. Margaret turned to her directly. "I'm giving you a choice, Miss Turner. You can leave this job today if you think you're beyond learning, or you can stay and prove that you deserve the uniform you wear." Jessica felt her heart pound. The humiliation of being called out, the realization of her own mistakes, it was overwhelming. But underneath it all, there was something else. A second chance. She had expected punishment. Instead, she was being given an opportunity. For the first time in a long while, she felt something shift inside her. A moment later, she inhaled deeply and met Margaret's gaze. "I want to stay." Margaret studied her, then nodded once. Then let's see if you mean it. With that, the conversation was over. But Jessica knew this wasn't the end. It was just the beginning. Jessica left the jet bridge with a strange mix of emotions swirling inside her. Relief, embarrassment, and something else, determination. The flight had started like any other, but it had ended with her being forced to take a hard look at herself. She had spent years believing she was efficient, that her no-nonsense approach made her a strong flight attendant. But now she saw the truth. She had let her frustration chip away at her patience, treating passengers as tasks rather than people. And today, it had finally caught up with her. As she walked back into the cabin, the other flight attendants avoided her gaze, unsure of what had just transpired. Rachel, however, stepped closer, hesitating before speaking. "Are you okay?" she asked softly. Jessica met her eyes and, for the first time in a long while, let her guard down. "I don't know," she admitted, "but I think I will be." Rachel nodded slowly, seeming to sense the shift in Jessica's demeanor. Passengers were still disembarking, many of them sneaking glances at her. Some looked smug, as if satisfied that she had been put in her place. Others seemed indifferent, already moving on with their day. But one woman, a middle-aged passenger with kind eyes, paused for a moment as she passed by. "People make mistakes," she said gently. "It's what you do after that matters." Jessica didn't know how to respond, but the words stayed with her. By the time the cabin was empty, the weight of everything settled on her shoulders. 6 months of supervised work. A return to training. It felt like she was being sent back to square one. But for the first time, she didn't see it as a punishment. She saw it as a chance. That night, as she sat in her apartment, she replayed the day's events in her mind. Margaret had given her a lifeline instead of ending her career. But why? Most executives would have fired her on the spot, used her as an example. Yet Margaret had chosen to teach her instead. Curious, Jessica pulled out her phone and searched for information about Margaret's early career. She had assumed the chairwoman had climbed the ranks through privilege, but the truth was far more humbling. Margaret had started as a flight attendant decades ago, working long hours, dealing with the same pressures Jessica had faced. But instead of letting the job harden her, she had let it shape her. She had learned from every difficult passenger, every stressful moment, and had eventually risen to a leadership role, not because of power, but because of understanding. Jessica leaned back against the couch, staring at the ceiling. Maybe that was what Margaret had seen in her. Someone who still had the potential to change. The next morning, she reported to the training center, where she was greeted by a senior instructor who had been with the airline for over 30 years. "Back to basics," he said with a small smile. "Let's see what you've forgotten." The first few days were humbling. Jessica had to relearn everything. How to engage with passengers, how to handle complaints with patience, how to balance authority with kindness. It wasn't that she had forgotten the procedures, but she had lost sight of their purpose. One afternoon, as part of a training exercise, she was asked to role-play with another trainee who pretended to be an elderly passenger struggling with her seatbelt. A week ago, Jessica might have sighed, done it for her quickly, and moved on. But now, she knelt down beside the woman, speaking softly and guiding her hands until she got it herself. The instructor, watching nearby, nodded approvingly. "That's more like it." Slowly, Jessica began to change. Not overnight, and not without effort. There were still moments of frustration, but she caught herself now. She started listening more, responding with patience instead of irritation. And she noticed the difference, not just in how passengers reacted, but in how she felt. Months passed, and the time finally came for her first unsupervised flight. As she stepped onto the plane, she felt something she hadn't in years, a sense of purpose. The flight was smooth, uneventful, until an elderly man in first class accidentally knocked over his coffee. Jessica was the closest attendant, and for a split second she saw her old self in her mind. Annoyed, rolling her eyes, brushing him off. But instead, she smiled. "Let's get you cleaned up," she said gently, grabbing napkins and helping him without rushing. The man looked at her with gratitude. "Thank you, dear." And in that moment, Jessica realized something. It wasn't just about keeping passengers happy or avoiding complaints. It was about making people feel seen, respected. She finally understood what Margaret had meant. After the flight, as passengers were disembarking, Jessica was straightening a seatbelt when she noticed a familiar figure standing near the front of the plane. Margaret. Jessica's breath caught, but this time, it wasn't out of fear. Margaret met her gaze and smiled slightly. "How was the flight?" Jessica hesitated, then smiled back. "Better than before." Margaret nodded. "I had a feeling you'd figure it out." Jessica swallowed, her voice quieter now. "Thank you for giving me a second chance." Margaret studied her for a moment before responding. "Second chances don't mean anything unless you do something with them." Jessica nodded, fully understanding now. As Margaret turned to leave, she paused briefly and said, "Keep going. You're on the right track." And just like that, she was gone. Jessica took a deep breath and looked around the empty cabin. She had started this journey thinking she knew everything, that passengers were just obstacles in her routine. But now, she saw things differently. She wasn't just a flight attendant. She was part of something bigger. And for the first time in a long while, she was exactly where she was meant to be.